So what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, just a little bit about variation, and then some examples of natural selection, and we'll briefly talk about sexual selection as well. So the first question we're going to ask is, well, why are we all so different from each other? Why in nature are individuals of a certain species each unique with different traits? Where does that come from? And there are actually two answers. Mitchell, you know one? That is correct. But I'm sort of asking, why do they have different genes? Okay, what's going on, Danielle?
Okay, so since everybody has different genes, their parents had different genes, and when they had a baby, it made the baby's genes, like both their genes were mixed, which made the babies different.
Excellent.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's the exact right answer. So one is because of sexual reproduction. So you know you're not identical to your sibling, right? Even though you have the same exact parents, and you came from the same genetics from each of those parents, you're not identical to your siblings. And that's because when sexual reproduction takes place, the offspring get half of their genes from the mother, half from the father. Which half you get from each parent is random. And so you happen to get a different set of genes and chromosomes from your mother and your father versus your brother or your sister. And every time sexual reproduction happens, it sort of shuffles the deck and deals out cards from two decks, and you never really end up with the same combination. And so sexual reproduction vastly increases variation within a species. And most of the species we've been talking about do reproduce sexually. We talked about the other day, not all organisms. There are some organisms that only reproduce asexually, but most of the ones we've been talking about reproduce sexually. But even those that reproduce asexually, things like bacteria, they still have variation. Even though this process of sexual reproduction is not taking place, they have variation due to something called mutations. When cells are dividing, and one cell is forming two cells, part of that process is the DNA in the cell gets copied so that each cell can get its own copy. However, sometimes mistakes are made. Often mistakes are made. Some of the letters that make up the DNA get changed. Sometimes the DNA letter gets removed or added in. And what happens, what do you think happens if you change the DNA of an organism? What? Yeah, you change something about them. You change one of their characteristics possibly. And so that could add new variations within a population. So even though these two bacteria came from one parent and it just split, well, one of those bacteria could have gotten a mutation that made it slightly different. And so that's where some of that variation comes from. And now these bacteria are not identical to each other. Some of them may have some trait that helps them survive better. So a mutation is a sort of unplanned change in the DNA of an organism. Kind of like a mistake. Now, sometimes a mutation can happen, and it can be harmful. Something doesn't work right in that organism. And what do you think happens to those individuals? Yeah, they don't survive. So those negative mutations typically don't persist. Sometimes those mutations might be neutral, might not have any effect. Other times they might be helpful. If they're helpful, what happens to that mutation in a population? It becomes more common, right? Because that individual survives better and reproduces, passing on that mutation to the next generation. Now, these variations can be very, very small. But because evolution happens over many, many millions of generations, even tiny little differences can build up into really big differences over a period of time. And that's what this video that we'll watch maybe later will talk about. Let's talk about an example. This is not exactly natural selection. In natural selection, what's deciding which organisms survive and which don't? Nature. This is an example of something called sexual selection. Many species that reproduce sexually have evolved through this process of sexual selection. In sexual selection, it's not so much about survival, but it's about reproduction. For example, these are, what do you call these? So really they're called peafowl, is the general term. Males are peacocks and females are peahens. Okay? So female peafowl, which are called peahens, they pick a mate. So it's the female that selects which male she's going to mate with to produce the young. And so she chooses mates based on what? Their tail feathers, the coloration. And females typically choose males that have larger, more colorful, more showy tails. And so the more impressive the tail of the male peacock, the more likely it is to what? Reproduce, find a mate, and have offspring. And when those little baby ostriches are born, the males are probably going to have what kind of tails? Big, showy tails. Okay.
Wait, why is the female one like?
Good question. This is a pattern we often see in many animals. The males of the species are often brightly colored, often have larger, showy feathers or fur, whereas the females often are kind of drab colored, just sort of dull, brownish, grayish coloration. Why would that be important? Olympia?
So predators don't notice them?
Yeah, because often in these species, it's called sexual dimorphism, differences in appearance of the sexes in animals, is that often the females are caring for young or caring for eggs, incubating eggs, and it's better for them through natural selection to be hidden, to be sort of blending in with their environment. So natural selection has favored females that are sort of boring in color or smaller, not showy. But sexual selection has favored males, which are more showy. So females chose the brightest males and the ones without impressive tails didn't find mates, and therefore didn't pass on their genes to the next generation. So this trait that was selected for were those large, colorful tails, and smaller tails were selected against. Now let me ask you a question. Why aren't their tails 12 feet long? If the females are favoring longer tails, why aren't they enormous tails? Sophia?
Because they haven't evolved longer yet.
That's an idea. But I'm thinking of another idea. Layla?
It can only get so big before it ruins their chance of survival.
Yeah. So you can imagine, well, if they were 12 feet tall, now maybe they stand out so much, predators have an easier time finding them. Or they're so large it makes it difficult for them to get around and find food. And it would no longer be an advantage. So therefore, they would not be selected for if they were too large. Same thing with giraffes' neck. Well, if giraffes have a long neck and they evolved so they could reach high into trees, shouldn't their necks be even twice as long as they are today? No, because it becomes a disadvantage. Okay? If their necks were twice as long, first of all, their heart can't get blood up to their brain. They already have special adaptations to allow that right now. They'd be top heavy. They'd fall over easy. Predators could find them or could kill them more easily because they wouldn't be very mobile. So natural selection is working to keep their necks not so long that it becomes a disadvantage, but long enough that it's still an advantage to getting that food.
So when animals like polar bears, if they were gonna mate, the polar bears with the thicker fur, wouldn't they mate the two polar bears with thick fur?
Wouldn't they mate together?
Yeah, but for peacocks, you can't.
Right, because polar bears don't have a difference between male and female in their fur, but peacocks do. So like we said, that can't happen in polar bears because there's no variation between males and females. Oh, we'll get to that in another unit. So I'm not going to hold off on that question for right now. Okay, what? All right. You could imagine, anyone do like any bird watching or have bird feeders in your backyard? So I spent some time this summer, I got some new binoculars, I was looking at birds a lot in my backyard, we have some feeders. And if you see like, sexual dimorphism is really common in birds. Like if you see a cardinal, if you see a red cardinal flying around your yard, is that a male or female? That's a male. Do you know what a female cardinal looks like?
It's like brown.
It's kind of brownish. It might have a little reddish tint. It has the same shape, same crest and everything, but it's just sort of a brownish color. You see that all the time in lots of different mallard ducks. You know, if you think about a typical mallard ducks, they have a green wing pattern, that blue stripe. Females are kind of just brownish and speckled in color. All right, to summarize natural selection, any variation in a population selected for will become more abundant. Any variation selected against will become rare. Okay? That's good.
What is that?
Not
Oh,
necessary.
there were peaks.
I like these. All right, Darwin
Darwin.
noticed a really important example. This is an example used to lots of these finches. So you know what a finch is? Kind of a small bird. So remember Darwin's voyage. Where did he go?
Around the world.
All the way around the world. Most of his time was spent around South America. He spent a significant amount of time in these islands that are off the northwest coast of South America called the Galapagos Islands. And these islands, there's a series of these small islands. And what Darwin noticed on the Galapagos is that the finches kind of were similar in some ways. The finch on each island kind of had the same sort of body shape and things like that, but they were each slightly different. And what he noticed is that each finch had certain characteristics that helped it to be successful on that island, because each island had different foods. Different foods were more abundant. So some of these finches evolved, so they all originated as one species that made its way from the mainland of South America, dispersed onto these islands. But once these finches were on the islands, they each started to take a different kind of pathway through evolution. Some of these finches that evolved on islands with lots of seeds, slowly over time evolved to have a thicker beak to crack those seeds open. And the ones that had smaller seeds had a thinner beak that still could crack them open, but wasn't as thick as the others. Some evolved to eat fruit and a special beak to help them cut through the fruit. Some evolved to eat cactuses. Some evolved a longer beak to probe into crevices to get insects. And so even though they were very similar, they each had these unique, helpful adaptations that allowed them to survive and be successful. So here's a finch that eats fruit. Here's one that eats thick, large seeds. This one eats small seeds. This one eats small insects, large insects, cactus. So it's not really important to know which finch is which, but it's important to know they had all evolved to suit whatever conditions were there on that island, because there was natural variation in their beaks that was selected for or selected against. Did anyone have strep throat or an ear infection over the summer? So probably I would guess almost everybody's had an ear infection or strep throat sometime, right? So if you go to the doctor and you have strep throat, they gag you with the huge Q-tip, they culture, say, yes, you have strep throat. How do they treat you? What's the treatment for strep throat? They give you an antibiotic, probably. An antibiotic is a special medication that kills what? Bacteria. And you take the medicine. After a couple days, say they give you a 10-day prescription for amoxicillin, that pink, gross-tasting one.
I love that.
That one tastes good, isn't
All
it?
right, anyway, they give you amoxicillin. You take it for 3 days, and your throat feels all better. Do you throw it away?
No.
What does the doctor tell you to do? Use all of it. Even if you feel better, continue taking the full prescription until it's gone. The reason they tell you that is because of evolution, because of natural selection. So imagine what's happening in your throat to these bacteria. So you have a sore throat because somehow you got some of these streptococcus bacteria in your throat. Their population is growing. They're irritating your skin. They're destroying it. It's raw. It's red. It hurts. Then you start taking the antibiotic. That's a medicine that kills bacteria. You take it day 1. Don't really feel much better. Day 2, you start to feel a little better. Day 3, you feel a lot better. Which bacteria have you killed off? Well, not all the bad ones. Yeah? And which ones die off first?
The ones you can actually.
Non-resistant.
Yeah, the ones that are kind of the weakest, right? The ones that just a little exposure to the antibiotic kills them. But probably after 3 days, you didn't kill all of them. Which ones are still hanging on in there? The stronger ones, the ones that have a natural resistance. And so after day 3, you say, all right, I'm not taking this anymore, and you throw it away. Now what happens in your throat? Those strong ones that were resistant, they're still there. And they start to regrow the population. And 2 or 3 days later, you say, oh man, my throat hurts again. But this time, what's that infection going to be like? Worse. And if you go back and you take amoxicillin again, it might not work. Because the bacteria that live in your throat are resistant to it. Okay, you selected for the strongest bacteria. So they tell you to take it all because if you take all 10 days, it's likely that even ones that have some resistant are going to be killed off. And you'll kill all of them. And that's why they tell you to take all of your antibiotics. The same thing can happen in pesticides that we use in our gardens. You spray some pesticides in your tomato plants, it kills off some of the insects, but might only kill off the weakest ones. Don't worry about this. The stronger ones might still be present. Camouflage is a really common adaptation. It's really cool to talk about. Sorry, I just want to show you some pictures. You see the spider there in this flower?
What is that?
Ibises. These are small deer-like creatures. They live in the Middle East. They live in like Israel. Here's one. Here's one small one facing you. Here's one walking across the rocks. They live in this dry, rocky environment, so they blend in perfectly. We'll talk about pepper moths tomorrow. You see 2 moths? There's one here. There's the lighter one. Here's the darker one. Oh, wait, what's that? Oh, yeah. See this chameleon? Looks just like a leaf. We got more. See an animal here?
I see something.
Yes.
No, you don't. You're just saying.
The green one in the middle?
What kind of animal do you see?
Nothing.
I see nothing.
You're tricking us.
No.
Oh, I just.
I thought it was like a rabbit or a fox.
See anything here?
I see a sloth.
Owls. Owls.
Right there. Yeah, I saw the sloth.
You'd be hard to see if you didn't see it.
Anything here?
The bug.
What is it? It's a frog.
It's a frog. I saw the leg.
Anything?
Yes.
Of course there is.
Right there in the front.
I think I see something. I can't tell what it is.
It's like a bobcat.
Oh.
We'll talk about pepper moths tomorrow, but there's one here.
It looks like lichen. We have this one. That's
Can we talk about mimicry today?
yeah. We have 5 minutes.
What?
We have 1 minute.
Mimicry is when one species evolves, let's just write it down, to look like another species. Sometimes to attract prey, sometimes to avoid predators.
Whenever I watch a documentary about animals,
You know what this is?
No. Snake? Oh, it's snake.
It's a coral snake. It's deadly. This is not a coral snake. It's a harmless king snake.
I told you there's no minute. We didn't believe.
Yeah, we'll finish tomorrow. All right, have a good day, everybody.
Put this back up tomorrow.
Yes, I'll put this back up tomorrow.